Tonight we're going to be talking about the Richmond Vivianite discovery, which I know a lot of you who are in this presentation right now are very familiar with. But we're going to be discussing it in the context of a locality chapter within the future Classic Mineral Localities of Virginia book. So we're going to be basically breaking it down and talking about the location. I use the Vivianite locality because I have a close relationship with the members of the Richmond Club, and a lot of them have the history of this locality. And since there's only one primary mineral that we're talking about here, it makes it a lot easier to kind of use this locality as an example for what we want to talk about, what we want to accomplish with the book. So what we're going to focus on tonight is first, what is a locality report? I think it's important for us to, know what do I mean when I say these locality reports that we'll be working on. A locality report design, unfortunately, I wasn't able to Zoom, record, have PowerPoint open, and have my Adobe InDesign open. So you're going to have to bear with me. I took some slides from, or some photographs from the actual design, but everything that we'll be covering in the PowerPoint will be what was in the actual document. And then we're going to get into I want to talk about what is Vivianite. Not everyone knows what Vivianite is who may be watching this. And then we're going to get into the bulk of the discussion, which is the Richmond Vivianite discovery itself. And so the geology, mineralogy, the discovery itself in the background, mineral specimens. This locality actually had fossils that were associated with the Vivianite, so we'll talk a little bit about those fossils. The mineral uses of Vivianite, if it's important, if it's not important, light exposure and disintegration. And light exposure is a big topic with Vivianite, and then especially specimens from the Richmond locality. There's a huge issue with them falling apart over the years. And then we want to focus on museum quality specimens, because as I'm out there, I'm always trying to find specimens that basically highlight the potential of a locality. And that's the ones that we want to photograph and put out there in the book. So there's a few pieces that, come to mind that are in museums that we want to photograph for the book. Is there any gaps in the knowledge? What are we missing? What do I still need to find out? Because, this is just a draft. I'm just showing you a draft example of the chapter. And there are some gaps that I think, for those watching now and for those that will be watching at a later date can help us kind of fill those gaps. And then I just for fun wanted to mention 3 localities that I think are rather important when we talk about Vivianite across the world. 3 locations that a lot of people think about when they think about Vivianite. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And then I know all of you are excited. We're going to be doing the VMP display. For those that are watching at a later date, unfortunately, I'm going to have to switch over to my other phone, so I won't be able to record it. But I may do a separate video. And over here to the right, you see an old photograph. This is from Betsy Martin. It's Pete McCreary and C.H. Bottoms. And they're looking at some of the Vivianite specimens that they just found. And I always love this picture because it's funny to look at how people would get off work. Rock hounds, we don't really care what our clothes look like, and they've got off work in their business suits and went over to the locality to go collect mineral specimens. And this is a great photograph of them too, looking at some of the Vivianite they were discovering. So what is a locality report? Well, when I talk about locality reports, I'm basically speaking as if they're mini publications, and they're roughly around 10 pages per report. And some are smaller and larger than others. And think about the 10 pages are going to be front and back, so you can cut that in half. And you would say that the Vivianite report wouldn't be as large as the Rutherford mine or the Moorfield mine. Those are going to be larger because they have a lot more data. They had a longer time span of collection. And so these things change depending on the information, depending on the amount of research that is out there and what we want to cover. And then the one thing that I really want to do with these locality reports is I wanted to bring people in from the community to work together and co-author. I know that Scott Dureski's here tonight, and we are talking about, the work that he did with the microlights at the Rutherford mine. We want to include that in the Rutherford section, right? So I want to work with people. And a lot of what we're going to be seeing tonight comes from stories and interviews and documents that I've worked with Pete McCreary, Betsy Martin, Andy Dietz, and Rudy Bland. And they had a lot to say about these localities. So there are people that have been involved in these locations, people that have those collections. And I really want to support those people and have them have a voice in this chapter, in these chapters, and be able to have their name because they are a part of that history. And so for those of you who are familiar with the mineralogical record or rocks and minerals, think of this as kind of like a locality article but we get to go a little bit more in depth besides just the minerals. We're going to go into the history and the cultural context of some of these locations. And so each of these reports, they contain an introduction, the history of the discovery, the mineralogy and geology. There are chapter-specific discussions. So the Vivianite, we talk about light sensitivity, and we talk about, disintegration and degradation of the specimens. That doesn't make sense for all localities, right? Or the Miocene fossils. So there are specific discussions that each chapter will have, and that basically develops some sort of flexibility when we're writing this to kind of have the chapters mold the uniquity behind their own locations. Educational highlights. I want to go back in after we finish the reports and look at Virginia SOL standards, and I want to be able to take information and make it usable by teachers in school, in schools. How does this relate to SOLs? How can we use this as a teaching method for people? It's not meant to be a textbook by any means, but I think it is really important when we talk about teachers in their schools having to talk about Virginia geology, Virginia mineralogy, to have some resource that they can go to talk about that. Economic, social, and strategic importance. There's no strategic importance of the Vivianite discovery, but some locations there are, like the Moorfield or the Rutherford mine. And so if there's any special things, we'll talk about it. You can think of the Willis Mountain kyanite. We can talk about the economics importance of that. So that would be a discussion we would have with that location. Index of minerals. I think for a lot of people, we liked with the R.B. Dietrich book is that when we have locations, we know what's there. And MnDAT does this a lot, but we want to have it in a book form so people can see the minerals that have been highlighted there. And in red, I have here references and additional reading and the MnDAT link. And this is basically the last page of the locality report. And what this is, it basically is saying, here's, further reading, here's the resources, the reports that have been out there. So tonight we'll talk about Rudy Bland's 1966 Rocks and Mineral article, and that would be included in this, right? Where's the past research? Where can you go to learn more? And then one of my biggest things, and I talked to some people over at MnDAT, is I really want to support MnDAT, and I want us to be able to work with them. And so we can't put every photograph in this book, right? And we can't put every piece of information that we receive at the Virginia Mineral Project, but we can put out things on MnDAT and continue to support MnDAT while also continuing to work on the book. And so things that are in the book will be used to go over to MnDAT, and that at the end of the book, there may be a scan code or something that people can basically continue from there. And MnDAT's interactive, right? You have maps, you have links, you have things that people can click on. So there's a lot more things you can do than a paper copy. So we'll definitely want to support MnDAT. Over here to the right is a really beautiful Vivianite specimen from Andy Dietz's collection. And this is just one of the specimens that we'll see tonight. I really like this specimen. It's about, I didn't put the information on this photograph, but it's about the size of your hand or your fist. So here is a photograph or a snapshot of what things are looking like right now. So don't worry about the words. We're covering this tonight, so you don't have to worry about reading all of it. But this is basically the first 2 pages and the layout that I have as of now. Like I said, this is what I'm looking at on InDesign. Unfortunately, I'm not able to show it to you while we're doing the Zoom session. But this is what things are looking at. The one biggest, every chapter has its positives and negatives. The biggest thing that I want to make sure with the Vivianite chapter is the color, right? We're dealing with black and white photographs. We're dealing with a rather tan and black mineral specimens. So trying to put some color into it, trying to make it more engaging is something I want to do. I also like to use no background on the minerals. I was inspired by the Smithsonian books that had a lot of the minerals just kind of popped on the pages. And I thought that looked really, really nice and looked very fresh and clean. And then over here, we'll have a larger picture here in a second. I'm going to be looking at this photograph that is Rudy Bland right here, and he's looking at the deposit of the Vivianite crystals. And I want to do a geologic overlay and kind of show you the different layers that have been highlighted there and show you a little bit more about the zoning. So there will be some color that will be added into it at a later date. All right, and here's a second example page. This is around 2 pages later into the discussion here. And we're looking at a special topic, right? So we're looking at the special topic of light and moisture sensitivity. We're looking at, a solution here that Rudy Bland mentioned in his 1966 article, which was basically saying, how do you seal a lot of the Vivianites that came from the Richmond locality that fell apart over the years? And so this is what I mean by including special topics. So if you think of the Rutherford mine, right? you'd have a chapter, or I mean, a paragraph or 3 paragraphs about the microlite research that was done. And then here, Vivianite in context, the history and uses of Vivianite, you know, not necessarily saying that it's important when it comes to economics or in the industrial sector, but here we talk a little bit about the history. And we can delve a little bit more into Vivianite itself here because it's just one mineral. Like, we can't do that for all hundreds and some minerals at Rutherford, right? But we can, again, this is the unique part about each chapter design. It can kind of focus on the strengths and weaknesses of each locality and the information that we're getting. And then I'm changing this right here. These are some of those notable occurrences. I'm just using these pictures as placeholders. But I'm working with people to look and get some photographs there to include in the book. So what is Vivianite? So Vivianite is a hydrous iron phosphate mineral, and it's pretty soft. It has a hardness of 1.5 to 2. And for those who collected at this location, you all know that it's a very soft mineral and it crumbles very easily. It has a very sharp cleavage, and that causes a lot of the times to be a very fibrous fracture, and that causes a lot of the specimens to kind of fall apart, especially the way that they're growing in the clay. As it dries over time, specimens will end up flaking off and breaking off, and we'll talk a little bit about that later and how you can seal the specimens. It is a secondary mineral, and it's found in a number of geologic environments. You know, you can find them in some phosphate-rich pegmatites. They've been known to be found in hydrothermal sulfide veins and marls and clays. And in our case, we're looking at a sedimentary clay environment, probably low oxygen environment. And it often forms with organic material, so shells or fossils. And tonight we'll see that it grew with a lot of the Miocene fossils. And sometimes it forms on or inside those fossils, which is really cool because that creates a lot of really beautiful combo pieces. And then, you know, who got the name Vivianite? Well, it was actually named after an English mineralogist, John Henry Vivian. He owned some copper mines. He was an industrialist. He was also a politician and a mineralogist. I always joke, when you go back to like the 1600s and the 1700s, people tended to have multiple, you know, expertise. But the type locality that Vivianite came from was in Wilkine, or sometimes it's Wilkine, in Cornwall in the UK. And over here to the right, you can see Henry Vivian, and this is a specimen from the Wilkine locality and showing you the type location. And I think it's kind of cool to look at this piece because, you know, Virginia has several type localities, and that basically means where the mineral was first noted and first discovered. And, you know, that Vivianite specimen right there doesn't look as nice as the stuff from Bolivia or some of the other countries. But, you know, when it's a type locality, it's still very important. And we share that with several minerals like Goose Creekite and Loudonite. And so it's always cool to kind of mention those type localities, especially when they're from your own state. So now let's get into the discovery background. You know, how did this kind of first come about? Well, from the interviews and from the people that I've spoken with, the earliest that we kind of go back with the Vivianite discovery was 1965, in November of 1965. And the story that I always like to talk about is Tom Smith, who was a member around the Richmond Club, and he brought some specimens over to Rudy Bland. And at the time, Rudy Bland owned a rock shop, and he brought some specimens, and he's like, "Hey, I found this outside in downtown Richmond. We were doing some construction." And Rudy was like, "Hey, that's Vivianite." And what's really interesting is that there was actually an article published in a newspaper around that time by a highway geologist, and they had actually misidentified them at first as actinolite crystals. And, you know, for mineral collectors, sometimes we laugh and joke, you know, a lot of the geologists and stuff, I mean, that's not their primary training to look at minerals and certain things like that in some of these places. And so Rudy was like, "No, this is actually Vivianite." And so it was around 1965 that you first started seeing notes in the records about the locality. And what was really interesting is that this was discovered during construction work around 14th and Ballard Street. If you want to think of it now, it's around I-95 and Broad Street, which is weird to think about considering, you know, this photograph that you see over to the right here does not look like Richmond right now. But it's really cool to see how things are kind of changed over time. I think there's a bank or there's some sort of municipal building that sits on top of the current location now. I'll go ahead and cut the banker break because there's plenty of more Walmarts that have found themselves on top of mineral deposits here in Virginia. So we'll cut the banker break for a second. And so When these specimens were first being discovered, and it kind of makes sense, is they were starting to get discovered by construction workers and local office workers that work nearby. And they are basically coming to the location, or they were already there anyways, working, and they were finding specimens. And then those got in the hands of local people, and ended up getting in the hands of the club members, and then it kind of spread from there. Um, and we see this with a lot of locations, right? You have construction workers, they find specimens. The same thing can be said with quarries. Um, that doesn't mean that people get told about it. Doesn't mean that it gets a little bit, larger view. But in this case, there was a lot of construction workers that were finding specimens. They ended up becoming, very keen on, hey, I can make some money off of these specimens, and ended up started selling specimens as well to collectors, because they were there working every day, and so they were able to find some of the nicer specimens. Here's a photograph of Pete McCreary, the Richmond Club. He had just found a specimen. He was walking down the hill there. This is actually published in a newspaper article from 1969, and it kind of talks about the location with members from the Richmond Club. And then, as I said, reports, they spread like wildfire eventually. A lot of rockhounds across the state started learning about it. Bordering states started coming and learning about the location. And I would say that the primary collecting, when I'm looking at the records, happened around 1965 to late 1969. Various issues kind of caused this to close down, trespassing, night collecting, digging on the walls. As more people came and more questions around who has the authority regarding the site, who has the collecting privileges at the site, as those things got more complicated, it was eventually closed down in 1969. I will delve a little bit more into the book about Operation Vivianite. I didn't talk about it tonight, but there was an initiative with the Richmond Club under the Vivianite Committee. There was a committee that was developed, and the idea is that we want to work with the DMME and the state geologists and try to go and preserve and collect specimens there. And they did some of that, and especially with the fossils as well. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that. I want to get a little bit more history first on Operation Vivianite, but I think that's one of those cool anecdotal things that, makes it really special when we talk about these locations. Those little cool stories when you hear something like Operation Vivianite. And then here's another photograph of Pete McCreary. He's actually digging out one of these dolomitic concretions, and that was described by Rudy Bland as kind of like a septarian nodule, but in this case, of course, it's not a calcite in the cracks here. It's more of the vivianites forming in the cracks. But this is Rudy Bland digging out a specimen there, and we'll see a few more photographs in a second. So now, what was the geology and the mineralogy of this site? Well, it is Miocene in age, more specifically the Lower Calvert Formation, around roughly 18 million years ago. And the specimens themselves were actually discovered in a horizontal zone. And it was described as kind of a tan marl, and within that tan marl, you had scattered dolomitic concretions. And if you look at the photograph here, you see Rudy Bland there, and then you can see these holes. And this is where people were digging and where the concretions were. What's really interesting here too is you can kind of see three different zones. You have this superimposed zone of Pleistocene age gravel around 1 to 2 feet before the construction work kind of threw a little bit more on top of it. You had that main zone, and then here you can kind of see in this blue bracket a little bit of disturbance there with kind of a downward trend, and you see that is the layer in which they're finding the Vivianite. And so marl itself in this case was a mixture of clay or illite and calcite, and it's typical of these deposits that you retain marine fossils and shells, and so that made a lot of sense when you start pulling these things together. And now this is a beautiful specimen. This is from Andy Dietz's collection. I saw Andy just join the session. And this is a photograph I took before the coronavirus hit. And this is a piece that really showcases the true quality of the Vivianite from Virginia. I mean, here you see this beautiful flowering Vivianite growing on the matrix there. One thing that's really interesting too is that you can still see that the blades have some sort of transparency to them. And what you're seeing right here with this tan border is that this is actually what Rudy Bland was describing as the Vivianite growing in the cracks. And so this is kind of one of those pieces of those concretions. And then that tan layer right there is basically where another rock was forming, and then the Vivianite was growing within that crack. And so this was a contact zone between that rock and the other rock that the Vivianite was growing. But this is a very remarkable piece. This is probably one of the best photographs I have currently of a matrix specimen from the location. And so, you found these specimens as sprays and clusters, but again, the biggest problem here, when you go back to Vivianite being very soft and having a lot of ability to break fairly easy because of its cleavage, it made it very fragile for cleaning. And people who collected here knew that the specimens, they were tough to handle, especially years later, if they weren't prepped properly. But as Rudy Bland describes it, and other reports describes it, you had basically two main areas in which, in that zone that we just saw, the Vivianite was forming. You formed in those cracks of those dolomitic concretions, and then the surrounding softer clays, which were probably the same material that was weathered away from that same layer. And it was stated that you could just dig with your hand into this material and find these Vivianite sprays and clusters that were in the clay. And so now let's talk a little bit more about the specific ways that we look at mineral specimens from the location. And again, think of that, what we're covering here is basically how we're talking about chapters in the book for each location. And one of the things that I think is very important to highlight are how do mineral specimens look like, what do mineral specimens look like from localities versus other localities, right? Because we know that with many locations in the world, a calcite from this location is very different than a calcite from another locality. It could be Tennessee or Missouri with the calcites from Elmwood. And what we're looking at here, there was basically 3 to 4 different varieties of the Vivianite. Oh, I almost forgot. And so there wasn't just Vivianite that was found at this location. Even though Vivianite was the primary mineral that a lot of people think about when they go back to the Richmond location, there were 3 other minerals that were found. There were jarosite, which was abundant supposedly at the southern end of the deposit. And this was basically just a yellow coating on the clay chunks. You had gypsum. There was a specimen of gypsum that was found. And then another specimen of marcasite that was found, a really small cluster of crystals of marcasite, which would, both of those would be really cool, or 3 of those would be really cool to photograph. I don't have any specimens that I photographed, so if anyone's listening and has specimens, that'd be cool to photograph. But when it came to the gypsum, the marcasite, there's only 1 specimen that was noted. All 3 of those were confirmed by X-ray analysis, so those were confirmed minerals at the site. So it wasn't just Vivianite that was being found here. But the way that we described the specimens from here is first there were these aesthetic loose radial sprays in the surrounding clays. And these were very sought after mineral specimens because they had great luster, they were very, very beautiful, they still had a lot of color to them. And then you had matrix specimens like we just saw, the ones that were attached to the dolomite and the marl, and those are really, really sought after. But a lot of mineral collectors know that, matrix specimens are always, a thing that we always look for when we're looking at a location because it adds some contrast to it. And in this case, with the Vivianites from Richmond, you had that tan and that black, and that really created a very beautiful contrast between the 2 different colors there, and that made the specimens a lot more valuable with collectors. And then one of the most common ones were these concretions are almost like masses of Vivianite. And these ranges kind of like very spheroidal masses to kind of unique formations. And I also call them like squished horizontal pancakes. Over to the right here, you can kind of see what we're talking about here, which is you have this kind of spike ball, almost like a porcupine, growing outwards. And this specimen showcases that, very fragile, had a lot of clay that was still in it, and trying to clean that specimen, that's going to be very, very difficult. Some of these were the lesser quality specimens from the location. I mean, you found a lot of these kind of masses, and those masses didn't clean up as nice as some of those radial sprays or the matrix specimens. Here you can see a photograph of what I'm talking about, those kind of flattened pancakes. You kind of see like a just very small, squished Vivianite cluster there, and then these are very difficult to clean, but we found a lot of those at the site. And then as I said at the top, I put in question 4. And the 4th one was sprays of Vivianite that were attached to fossil bones or found in association with fossil bones. And I know that they occurred at the site. I know that people have mentioned them being found there, and I do trust those individuals like Rudy and Andy and other people, but I don't have any photographs as of now of those specific pieces. And so if any of you that are watching have a specimen from there, that has Vivianite on a fossil bone or some sort of fossil location, I would be interested in photographing that, but I don't have any of those at the time. And then it kind of gets back into the fossils from the location, which is the fact that I don't really have that many photographs of fossils from the Vivianite discovery. I mean, Vivianite itself was the primary concern of a lot of mineral collectors. You know, paleontologists got involved when other specimens were found there, other bone material were found there. Again, referencing back to the 1969 article, you had this really cool, which is, I think is a mako shark's tooth. And that honestly is the only photograph I have of a shark's tooth from this location. It becomes very difficult if you collect shark's teeth. You know that a lot of them look very similar. So unless it has a label with it, or it's, you know, in the box with Vivianite specimens or someone who collected there, I can't really reference back someone saying, hey, this came from there. So anytime that we can get some fossil photographs, I'm really interested in doing that. And so there was not only just shark's teeth there was whale vertebrae that were found there. There is a specimen that I need to get photographed that we're still looking for, which has Vivianite attached to a whale vertebra. And there was also 2 porpoise skulls that were documented from the site. And those were donated to the Smithsonian, the Division of Vertebrate Paleontology. And I don't have photographs of those either. That's something that I would really like to get photographed because I think that's really interesting to see that in association with this deposit. And even though, again, this is a classic mineral locality book, when we're talking about something like this, it is important to kind of highlight some of the other stuff that was found there. So bringing in how are minerals and fossils sometimes found together would be a great educational point to include, especially with Vivianite and its mineralogy anyways being found with organic material. So what are the mineral uses of Vivianite? Well, you know, to be honest with you, there's not much economic or industrial use at all. I mean, Vivianite is not a very important mineral when it comes to that. The main value that you see at Vivianite is with specimen collectors. I mean, people really appreciate the aesthetic value of the specimens, and that's okay. Not all minerals have an economic or industrial use. There have been some historical notes that showcase that Vivianite had been used as a pigment during the Roman Empire and around that time, which kind of highlights a very important point here, which is the fact that, you know, ancient civilizations and ancient empires used minerals and used things in paintings and necessarily didn't have a name for the minerals or didn't have something that was approved by the IMA or something like that, because that came way, way later, right? And so Vivianite, even though it was discovered around 1817, there is still some notes of it being used in old paintings. One specific painting that I found online, which I thought was really interesting, was the Procurus. It was painted by Dutch painter Johannes Vermeer, and here you can see the painting here, and the pigment itself was used for these kind of bluish gray parts of the carpet in the painting. So Vivianite can be used as a pigment in oil paintings and other paintings like that, but it's not necessarily, you know, the main thing. I did read something about how Vivianite had been used because of its blueness, because it lasted a lot longer. I didn't know this before, but according to some geology stuff, is that azurite, there was paintings of skies back in the time, and when they painted with azurite, it would kind of decay into like malachite, and so sometimes you'll see old paintings and they'll have like a green tint to it because it's kind of altered over those hundreds of years. And so Vivianite was used sometimes because it lasted a lot longer, was a lot stronger. And because it's soft, I know a lot of people always say, can you cab it or slab it, right? Or can you facet it? And because it's soft and because it's fragile, it's not something that you would recommend in lapidary work or fasting. I mean, you've seen that there have been some rough specimens that have been cabbed. These are some that are in free form from the Bolivian prospect. I think that you see that with countries like that where they're trying to make and maximize the most money out of their deposits. Here's kind of a photograph showing you what that looks like cut up. But again, it's very soft, it's very fragile. It wouldn't be recommended to have it as a, you know, kind of something you would wear out every day for jewelry, but it is interesting to see it when it's cabbed and slabbed. And so now, one of the most important things about Vivianite is the maintenance and care of specimens. That seems to be the discussion that everyone thinks of when they hear about Vivianite, is its light exposure and the sensitivity that it has to light. And I'm no chemist here, and I'm no, you know, mineralogist by any means, but I do want to kind of talk a little bit about what's actually occurring here causing the Vivianite to change colors. And what's actually happening here is there's an oxidation that's occurring, and that's resulting in the specimen's darkening. So Vivianite itself is actually clear. But as we all know, we normally find it as in blue or green sprays, and so it's normally darker. So what's happening is that when Vivianite hits visible light, you have photons, or this visible light, that actually get into the Vivianite, and they cause a proton to be knocked out of a hydrogen atom. Because when we go back to the chemical formula of Vivianite, we see that there are 8 water particles attached. And when it knocks out that proton out of the hydrogen nucleus, it converts that water into a hydroxyl ion, and, and that creates a negative charge. And of course, with chemistry and balancing things out, the specimen wants to basically become stable. And so you see this extra negative charge require an oxidation to occur. And so that Fe2 plus that's in the chemical formula actually turns into a ferric Fe3 plus. And that results in a stabilization, but that process actually causes a darkening to occur. What's interesting is that going from the clear form, it kind of transitions and gets darker and darker the less stable it becomes, or over time, due to that light sensitivity. So you could see a specimen kind of be a green Jimmy, and then it gets a little bit darker Jimmy, then it can get blue, especially depending on the way that the crystal lattice is and the light and how it approaches it. And then eventually it gets to a bluish black. And that's where we see a lot of specimens from the Richmond locality, which are very dark, dark black. What's interesting, though, about this oxidation is it's all internal. So sometimes when we think about oxidation of minerals, we think about something coming into the crystal or leaving the crystal, but there's no oxygen that actually enters the crystal, and there's no water that releases from the crystal. And so you see that liberated hydrogen ion, freely moving through that crystal lattice, so it's still in there. And one thing that I didn't even realize before I was doing the research on Vivianite was that this process of oxidation and getting to the point of turning dark black, actually, it's no longer technically Vivianite, more so is it metavivianite. It's actually changed its chemical structure, even though it's still a paramorph of Vivianite. It's now metavivianite. And according to the community, it's Kirchsteinite is the name for that. And one of the other issues that you see with Vivianites, especially from the Richmond location, is the deterioration, especially with the specimens that are in those kind of masses, those dark masses with the clay. Years later, collectors and museums alike would come back to specimens that were in their storage, and they would find them falling apart, completely destroyed. And as that clay dried, and as these Vivianite crystals had kind of grown out into that clay, it was almost as if that was keeping it together. And the fragility of it and the cleavage of it, they would just fall apart. And so there was a lot of discussion back in the days around how do we treat our specimens. And one of the things that was brought up by Rudy Bland in his 1966 article in Rocks and Minerals was a 5 parts acetone and 1 part Duco cement. And basically you mix that and you apply several coats or as needed for your specimen. And the beauty of that mixture is that it seals specimens and it doesn't give it an unnatural luster, because that's kind of the concern there, right? You want to seal the specimen, but you don't want the luster to become unnatural. And this, again, everyone may have their own things that they use to seal specimens. I know some of you in this chat may have their own techniques that they use to treat Vivianite specimens from the Richmond locality, but it was very important that the specimens were treated. And you can still do that today. But for many of us who held these specimens, every time you touch them, they'll fall apart. And so I always advise to not touch them as best you can, maybe put them on an acrylic stand and display them that way. And it is advised for the light sensitivity to not necessarily put it out in a lit case. We'll see a photograph here in a second of a beautiful specimen at the Laura Robbins Gallery that is in a lit case every day. But if you have a specimen like the one you see here, which is from David Gavell on Facebook, which is beautiful, stuff like that you don't want to have out in the light too much. So you want to keep it. They always say put it in a cotton box and kind of keep that inside and show it to people on a rainy day. Don't always have it out in your collection. But again, a lot of the specimens from the Richmond locality were already dark when they found them, which made sense because they were finding them out at a construction site. So by the time they got there, this process is relatively fast. It can happen in minutes or a day. to get some of the darkening from the purest forms. And so always be aware of that when you're handling these specimens. And then museum quality specimens. Besides from David Gravel's specimen that you just saw, and from the specimen in the beginning of Andy's specimen, these are two other specimens that are phenomenal for the locality. Over to the left here, we see something from the Laura Robbins Gallery, Richmond University, which I highly recommend people go to once things get better. The Richmond Club has a great relationship with them. And this specimen has a beautiful luster. It has been made sure it's preserved. It had the sealant on it that Rudy Blinn had mentioned. And it's a beautiful, beautiful piece. It's 5.8 inches by 5 and 2.8 inches. And you can still see up at the top, there's a little bit of green showing. That's normally how it was. You'll go to the ends of the crystals, not where it's all kind of bunched up, and you'll see some hints of green. If you look closely, you can kind of almost see some blue. There's some green right there. But this is one of the nicest specimens that I photographed, and kind of that, again, that aesthetic form and those kind of sprays. And then second here, we have a specimen, let's go back, that was photographed and put into the 1987 Mineral Locality Index with Alan Pinnock, which for Virginia mineral collectors, besides the R.V. Dietrich's 1990 book, this is another great resource for collectors. And in this article, there was a publication of a Vivianite specimen, and here you can see it's roughly around 7 inches, I guess, in length. And this was a photograph at the time by the Smithsonian Institute. And this kind of comes back to the whole idea that with the project, we're trying to get high quality images of old specimens. And so for me, if I ever find a specimen that was in the 1990 book or the old articles, I really want to rephotograph them, because I really think it's cool to see how photography's changed over the years. I think it's cool to have those classic, I call them classic specimens, because they were in our state publications, rephotographed. Although that was the original one, you kind of see a second one here. This was posted by the Rock Courier. Here we get a little bit more information. We actually have a number here and an acquisition date. And I would love to go to the Smithsonian and do some Virginia mineral photography in the future once things get a little bit more solidified. Basically do that with the Friends of Mineralogy as well. And when we have the ID numbers, it always makes it easier, right? Because if we just go in there and say, hey, can we photograph all Virginia specimens, they're going to throw us out. So it is good to have the reference number here. And this is a specimen that I would consider one of the classic pieces from the Vivianite locality itself. And so what are the gaps in the knowledge? You know, what are we still trying to understand, or what am I still trying to look into? Well, first, any more photographs that I can get, I always like to see more photographs. Photographs help not only in understanding the location, but understanding the mineralogy and the way the specimens looked. And the thing that we always try to do is we try to explain and describe specimens in a way that can help someone reading, or a museum or a collector, properly identify the difference between a Vivianite from this locality in Virginia from another one. I actually just got an email the other day. There was a museum in Denver that had acquired a calcite crystal or calcite clam from Virginia Beach, and we were trying to help them in identifying that specimen and where it came from, because they didn't know it was from Virginia Beach. But how is that calcite clam different from, let's say, Ruck's Pit in Florida, right? These are things that are very important with photographs. Is there any difference with field photographs? You know, finding more field photographs, that's always nice. If there's any in color. If there's any photographs of the porpoise skulls at the Smithsonian or reports, that would be really cool. And any fossils that have Vivianite attached, it's something I'm really, really wanting to find out more about. I want to understand fossils a little bit better at the site. I know that whale vertebrae were found there. I know that shark's teeth were found there, and the porpoise skulls, but what specifically were found there, right? What types of shark's teeth, what types of these different types of bones and specimens that were found there. And then always, you know, finding more collections, finding more people who've had beautiful specimens. There's a, you know, looking at the Dick Gillespie collection. You saw a piece back a second ago from Betsy Martin that had been gifted by Dick Gillespie. And finding specimens and finding these collections and just at least photographing them, getting that history. I always want to do that even until, you know, up to the day that the book is published. I think that's important to do. And then always looking more for more stories and anecdotal information. like Operation Vivianite. Operation Vivianite was something that I think was really interesting. The name's really interesting. It's kind of one of those cool anecdotal things. And I think that's something that we want to look at a later date and try to get more stories as possible. And then 3 notable localities. I'm just using these as reference pictures here. That I think if you're wanting to learn about Vivianite and you're wanting to, I would always say, hey, go to the Virginia stuff first, right? Because I'm a Virginia collector. But 3 locations that I think are great for people learning about Vivianite for the first time would be the green Vivianites from Bolivia. I mean, when you type in Vivianite online, you're going to first find green Bolivian Vivianites. They're very, very common. They're very well known. And then really cool specimens and combination pieces, which go back to the mineralogy of Vivianite, is the Vivianite clams from Ukraine and the Kerch Peninsula. And then a U.S. locality, which I always have a special affinity to U.S. localities, is the Blackbird Mine. And they had a lot of multicolored Vivianite and these beautiful violet Vivianites. So these are 3 locations that I think people would like to learn a lot about when you're thinking about getting involved and wanting to collect Vivianite outside of the Virginia location. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the video recording here, and we're going to have time for some questions.